All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we are concluding our unit on the Second Vatican Council. This is our third video in 3 videos. The first video, we talked about the historical context leading up to Vatican II, the centuries leading up to it. The second video, we talked about the 2 responses to the modern world. The first was a complete rejection of it, as epitomized by Pius IX, and the second is the Second Vatican Council, and we started to talk about the council in an overall way. What were some of the principles of it, for example. Today's video, what we want to do is we want to get into 4 of the most important documents, and obviously not have time to talk about everything here, but in our discussion we're going to dig deeply into that. So I just wanted to point out some really important highlights here. The first and the fourth document that we're going to talk about in this video, arguably the most important, and they kind of go together as bookends. The first is Lumen Gentium, light of the nations, that Christ is the light of the nations. And then that fourth document that we're going to talk about today, Gaudium et Spes, the joy and the hope. I think I've said this in previous videos, but church documents always are titled not by just the general theme of what they're all about, but the first 2 or 3 words of the document. And obviously these are written in Latin. The first one, Lumen Gentium, is the dogmatic constitution on the church, and the other one, the second one that we're the most important one, Gaudium et Spes, is the dogmatic constitution of the church in the modern world. So in other words, the first one is a reflection, an interior reflection on the nature of the church. What is the church? And then the second one is the look outward. The Gaudium et Spes, the looking at the modern world. How do we relate to the modern world? Again, it's not going anywhere. We can't stick our head in the sands. We need to pull our head out of the sands and deal with it. So that's what Gaudium et Spes is. So both of these documents are similar in that they're kind of a pendulum swing. Lumen Gentium is a pendulum swing in that for centuries now, when we talk about the question, what is the church? Because of the Protestant rejection of things like we talked about, the papacy, the priesthood in general, hierarchy, sacraments, those sort of hierarchical, tangible, visible signs of the church, those then became emphasized. You can see something similar in the artistic tradition of the church. If the Catholic Church, if Protestants reject statues and stained glass, images of Mary, well then, doggone it, the Catholic Church is going to emphasize those things. So after the Protestant Reformation, that's what the Catholic Church did. It emphasized all of those visible structures, sort of culminating at Vatican I, which again emphasizes the infallibility of the Pope. So Lumen Gentium kind of wants to do a pendulum swing back, a balancing act, to talk about not the exterior visible structures of the church, but also the internal, interior invisible aspects of the church. And so it's an important document for that, and we'll get into some of the specifics. And then Gaudium et Spes, as I said, is looking out into the modern world. How do we engage with it? The 2 documents, the short ones that we're going to talk about in the middle, relate in a sense to Lumen Gentium, and we'll see why. And they have to do with questions of interreligious dialogue, right? Hindus, Jews, Muslims, etc., and ecumenical dialogue. That's a dialogue among Christians. So how do we then engage with Protestants? Again, we got to stop sticking our head in the sand. We have to engage with them. One of the sort of important shifts, though this may seem sort of obvious, is prior to Vatican II, Protestants were often described as schismatics and heretics. The language was changed to separated brothers and sisters. So what that does is that shows that, well, the reality hasn't changed, right? The reality is that there is a separation between Protestants and Catholics. That was always a given. But that language of heretics and schismatics was a sort of very divisive language. Now, to call them separated brothers and sisters is still to recognize the reality of that division, but it's to say we're still brothers and sisters in Christ. We still have common things that we share. God as Trinity, one and Trinitarian, Jesus as fully human and fully divine, some of those fundamental Christian principles that we share. So those are the four things that we're going to get to today. So why don't we just jump straight into it? So this first document, Lumen Gentium, again, is the idea of what is the church, the question of what is the church. And you can see here, I'll put on the screen, a long list of descriptions or ecclesiological statements from Lumen Gentium. Ecclesia, meaning the church. Ecclesiology is the study of the church. It's sort of a subfield of theology. And in this document, the Council Fathers are trying to get at this question of what is the church from a variety of different directions, and it gives it the church a variety of different titles. So I'll just to name a few, that the church is a sacrament, a flock, a farm or field, the house of God, our mother, spotless spouse of the spotless Lamb, Christ's body, the bride, at once holy and always in need of purification, visible sacrament of his saving unity, and the mystical body of Jesus Christ. That mystical body became, in the 20th century, a popular way of describing it. So what Cardinal Avery Dulles, arguably the most important American Catholic theologian in the history of the church, his father, Dulles Airport, is named after his father. He was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and we can see that he's extremely important because he was named a cardinal, and he was never a bishop. Right? He's the first and only American to be named a cardinal who wasn't a bishop. He was a professor, a Jesuit. Catholic priest at several universities, including my alma mater, Catholic University of America. And he uses the phrase, the institutional church, right? Those visible structures, the hierarchy, right? Think of the bureaucracy, the curia in the Vatican. That's what had been emphasized for centuries. But that language that I just described to you, those titles, Christ's body, bride, our mother, emphasizing something different, not those visible hierarchical structures. So you can see here the pendulum swing. We want to read a couple of sections here that are extremely important. You can read along here with me. This is section 8. Section 8. Again, asking the question, what is the church? The one mediator, Christ, established and constantly sustains here on earth his holy church, the community of faith, hope, and charity, as a visible structure through which he communicates truth and grace to everyone. But the society equipped with hierarchical structures and the mystical body of Christ, the visible society, and the spiritual community, the earthly church, and the church endowed with heavenly riches, are not to be thought of as two realities. On the contrary, they form one complex reality comprising a human and divine element. For this reason, the church is compared in no mean analogy to the mystery of the incarnate Word. As the assumed nature inseparably united to him, Jesus, serves the divine Word as a living instrument of salvation, so, in somewhat similar fashion, does the social structure of the church serve the Spirit of Christ, who vivifies it in building up of the body. All right, what's going on there? Some sort of dense language. This document is comparing the church to Jesus, in that the church, like a lot of things in the life of Catholicism, is a mystery, and specifically a human and divine institution. Right? It's both at the same time. So it's comparing the church to Jesus. Jesus is one person, fully human and fully divine. God is one and Trinitarian. The Bible is a human document and a divine document, divinely inspired document. So following that sort of pattern of describing mystery here is to say that the church is a human institution and a divine institution. It has visible structures and it has invisible reality. So just as Jesus had a physical body that you could see and touch, think of Doubting Thomas, for example. It also has, just as Jesus, you couldn't see it, he was divine, and his divinity was invisible. You couldn't touch or feel his divinity. It was invisible. So too, the church has these invisible structures. So in that section that I just read out, it describes the invisible, the divine aspects of the church as truth and grace, mystical, a spiritual community, a church endowed with heavenly riches, and the Spirit of Christ sort of infuses the visible structures, right? So you can't really see any of those things, but they're sort of lurking underneath. Think again, for example, of the sacraments, right? The sacraments, the sacrament of baptism. You can see the water, you can drink the water, you can touch the water, you pour the water over the baby. But it is qualitatively different water than just regular water because it's been blessed. And what is really doing the work of salvation is what's invisible, right? The washing away of sins, the washing away of the guilt of original sin. And Lumen Gentium is, again, pairing those invisible aspects that I just described with the visible, the human. Community of faith, hope, and charity. It's hierarchical, visible society, an earthly church, and has social structures. So that list had been, again, emphasized for centuries at the detriment of the other invisible spiritual aspects of the church. And so Lumen Gentium wants to bring that pendulum back. Now, this is not some sort of abstract question, abstract intellectual exercise for academics, but it has to do with the spiritual lives of Catholics, right? If all we do is emphasize the hierarchical structures, that institutional model of the church that Avery Dulles called it, what does that do to our spiritual lives? It sort of withers on the vine. So in attempting to emphasize the invisible, the divine, the spiritual aspects of the church, Vatican II wants to revivify that interior life of the church. Let's just keep reading that next paragraph. And this is, as we're going to see here in a second, arguably the most important paragraph in all of Vatican II's documents. This is the unique Church of Christ, which in the Creed we profess to be one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, which our Savior, after his resurrection, entrusted to Peter's pastoral care, commissioning him and the other apostles to extend and rule it, in which he raised up for all ages as the pillar and mainstay of the truth. This church, constituted and organized as a society in the present world, subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. Nevertheless, many elements of sanctification and of truth are found outside his visible confines. Since these are gifts belonging to the Church, they are forces impelling towards Catholic unity. All right, what's going on there? Focus on that word, or that phrase there, subsists in, right? Think of like the term subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is when you farm and the produce that you grow, you live on it, as opposed to commercial farming where you take your produce to the market and you sell it and you make a profit, right? So subsistence means you live. So when it says this church, constituted and organized as a society in the present world, subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of the Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. What does that mean? It means that the invisible church that we were just talking about lives in the visible structures of the church, right? So yes, we have things like hierarchy and bishops and popes and all that stuff. So that the invisible church lives in the visible church. One way of thinking about it, again, is how the incarnate word lives in the visible structures of Jesus, or that the soul lives in the body. Now, why draw our attention to that? In fact, Avery Dulles calls this sentence here the most important sentence change from a draft of a Vatican II document to this final version that we just read. Now, why is that? Well, let's read here some draft language that you don't see in the text here, but came from an earlier draft. So from a first draft, that sentence read, "There is only one true church of Jesus Christ, which Christ entrusted to St. Peter and his successors and the Roman pontiffs to be governed. Therefore, only the Roman Catholic has a right to be called church." A later draft says, "The Church of Christ is the Catholic Church." All right? So notice that language there. The Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. In that draft version, there is no distinction, no difference whatsoever between the visible and the invisible, that they are one and the same. But the final version, as we said, the invisible subsists in it, lives in the visible. Think of it another way. Think of it like you and your house, right? You are not your house, but you live in your house, and you have, let's say, an intimate relationship to your house, such that, for example, if your house ever gets broken into and your stuff is stolen, your TV, your computer are stolen, you feel violated, right? In a way that, let's say, if your office at work was broken into, you wouldn't feel quite the same violation. But you have this intimate relationship with your house because you live in your house. So there is an intimate relationship between you and your house, but you are not your house. You subsist in, you live in your house. Okay, what does all this mean? Why is Avery Dulles wanting to point to this as an important shift, to say that the invisible and the visible are the same thing, that the Church of Christ is the Catholic Church, and that the invisible lives in, subsists in the visible? Well, let's go to that last line there again. It says, "Nevertheless, many elements of sanctification and of truth are found outside its visible confines." What does that mean? That means that the invisible church, yes, lives in, fills up the visible structures of the church, but cannot be contained by the visible structures. That Jesus is, in that analogy that was being made, Jesus' divinity, yes, Jesus was divine, but Jesus' human body cannot contain Jesus' divinity. That Jesus' divinity is bigger than Jesus' body. One way of thinking about it is, think about this water bottle, right? You've got this water bottle and it contains several ounces. So this is, in this analogy, the visible structures of the church. And the water inside is, in this analogy, the invisible. Now what happens? I've got about a third of this bottle full right now. What if I keep filling it and keep filling it and keep filling it? Well, at some point it's going to get full. But if we're talking about the invisible structures of the church, we should think about it in the analogy of the ocean. What if I tried to get the ocean in here? Well, I could start for the first few ounces, but eventually it's going to overflow. It's going to flow down the side of the water bottle. It's going to go on the floor. It's going to go out the room, right? It's going to go out the door. That the invisible cannot be contained by the visible, that the invisible overflows the visible. The invisible church lives in, subsists in the visible structures of the church, but cannot be contained by it, and so therefore overflows it. And why is that important? Because elements of sanctification and truth are found outside it. Where can that be found? Well, as we're going to see in these two later documents, can be found in other places outside of Roman Catholic Church. Protestantism, and even we're going to see in other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. So this shift in language here in Lumen Gentium is changing the ball game in our understanding of the church from a sort of either or, left and right, black and white. We are the true church. They, Protestants, Muslims, Hindus, etc., they are false, true, false, right? That sort of binary dichotomy. And changing it to, again, a sort of like a water bottle has some water, and then when it gets to the top, it has a fullness. This word fullness you hear throughout the documents of Vatican II, and you hear people use it all the time now, that the fullness of truth subsists in the Catholic Church. But again, the Catholic Church doesn't have a monopoly on it. So changing the language of our understanding of the Church from a binary either or, black, white, in, out, to that sort of fullness language of the glass has some water in it, it has half water in it, or it's a full glass. So this radically shifts our understanding of the Church, and therefore shifts our relationship to other religions. Okay? So let's put a pin in that and move on to the next document. All right, now what we want to talk about now is ecumenism, ecumenical dialogue. How do we relate to our Protestant brothers and sisters? Again, changing that language to brothers and sisters from heretics and schismatics. This document, very short but very important, Unitatis Redintegratio. I always have trouble saying that language, but the decree on ecumenism. So short but important document. Let's read a couple of sections here. This is page 502. Page 502, section 3. In this one and only Church of God, from its beginnings there arose certain rifts, which the apostle strongly censures as damnable. Anytime you see the apostle, that's always Paul, right? Think about Paul and all the rifts, the fighting that happened in the early church. But in subsequent centuries, much more serious dissensions appeared, and large communities became separated from full communion with the Catholic Church. Notice that word full. I just talked about that. Fullness, that there are other Christian groups that are in communion, but not in full communion. So we'll talk more about that here in a second. For which, often enough, people on both sides were to blame. Now that is a radical claim that we can't pass up. The Catholic Church here is hinting at the Protestant Reformation, and what's it saying? It's saying, yes, those Protestants have a lot of blame to own up to, but we Catholics have a lot of blame in that as well. That is not something you'd heard prior to Vatican II, that the Catholic Church is willing to say, maybe we didn't do the greatest job of loving our neighbor in the 16th century. Don't minimize how important that is. The Catholic Church is saying something quite important here. However, one cannot charge with the sin of separation those who at present are born into these communities and in them are brought up in the faith of Christ. And the Catholic Church accepts them with respect and affection as brothers and sisters. These are people who were born into Protestant communities. They didn't choose to be born into it. They didn't cause the Reformation, right? The Reformation at this point happened hundreds of years ago. So how can we blame people for being born into communities that they didn't create and they didn't choose to be born into? For those who believe in Christ and have been properly baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit with the proper Trinitarian understanding, are put in some, though imperfect, communion with the Catholic Church. If you are baptized, you are in some, though an imperfect, communion with the Catholic Church. This is most important. For example, if you are, let's say, a Lutheran and you want to become Catholic, you want to go through the RCIA process and become a Catholic, you're not sort of second baptized or rebaptized. That your baptism as a Lutheran is accepted. That the Catholic Church looks on that baptism as a legitimate sacrament. And by the nature of that sacrament, you are in communion with the Catholic Church, though it's not a full communion because, again, obviously Protestants and Catholics are not in full communion with each other. So they are not sort of totally other. Protestants are not totally other. They are, again, think of the water bottle image, right? They have some water in their water bottle, right? That baptism gives them some water in the water bottle, if you want. They're in some, though imperfect, communion with the Catholic Church. Continuing, without doubt, the difference that exists in varying degrees between them and the Catholic Church, whether in doctrine, sometimes in discipline, or concerning the structure of the Church, do indeed create many obstacles, sometimes serious ones, to full ecclesiastical communion. The ecumenical movement is striving to overcome these obstacles, but even in the spite of them, it remains true that all who have been justified by faith and baptism are incorporated into Christ. They therefore have a right to be called Christians, and with good reason are accepted as brothers and sisters in the Lord by the children of the Catholic Church. This seems utterly unremarkable to us in the 21st century today, but simply saying Protestants are Christians, that is a major shift that was disruptive in many ways, and a lot of people weren't too keen on that. But because they're baptized, Protestants are baptized, then we have to call them Christians, that they are in some communion with the church because of their baptism. The ecumenical movement at this point, ecumenical dialogue, discussion among Christians, had been happening for some time among Protestants, and certainly individual Catholics might have been interested in ecumenical dialogue, but the Catholic Church was kind of late to the party here. That the Catholic Church prior to this really wasn't interested in ecumenical dialogue. The point simply, the Catholic Church was, hey, you guys left, there's nothing to talk about, you just need to come home, right? Come home. And now this is a shift in that language and saying, certainly we would love to have Protestants come home, but the idea is you're Christians and you're baptized, your baptism is legitimate, and you are in some communion with the church. All right, let's jump ahead to just a little bit to page 503. We're still in section 3 here. It's the paragraph that begins, "It follows." It follows that the separated churches and communities as such. So separated churches, we don't have time to get into this language. That's referring to what we often call Eastern Orthodoxy. And communities, right? Ecclesiastical communities, church communities, that would be Protestants. So this is sort of the technical language that the Catholic Church uses. We don't have time to get into in this video, but the Catholic Church looks on those two with distinction. It doesn't lump those together. That there are important differences between what we call Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestants. Specifically, Eastern Orthodoxy shares with Catholicism apostolic succession, that their bishops go all the way back to the beginning of the church, where, of course, Protestant bishops go back to, if they have bishops, a lot of them don't even have bishops, they reject it, go back to the 16th century. So there's an important difference, and the difference in Eucharistic theology, that even though Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't use the exact language that Catholics often use, specifically the language of transubstantiation, that they have the same understanding of the Eucharist, specifically the idea of the real presence, whereas the Protestants reject that. Okay. It follows that the separated churches and communities as such, though we believe they suffer from defects already mentioned, have been by no means deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation. For the Spirit of Christ does not refrain from using them as means of salvation, which derive their efficacy from the fullness, there's that word fullness, of grace and truth entrusted to the Catholic Church. In other words, what? That those communities, those churches do have some means of salvation, that in being cut off fully from the Roman Catholic Church, they are not cut off entirely from the Catholic Church. And again, not meaning the necessarily the visible structures, but those invisible structures, thinking back to Lumen Gentium. I'm hoping you're starting to see why that conversation we had at the beginning of this video about the visible and the invisible starts to become important. That visible and invisible distinction that subsists in is relevant to how we think about those other communities and churches. Nevertheless, our separated brothers and sisters, whether considered as individuals or communities and churches, are not blessed with that unity which Jesus Christ wished to bestow on all those to whom he has given new birth into one body and whom he has quickened to newness of life. That unity which the Holy Scriptures and the ancient tradition of the church proclaim. Right? Jesus prayed, his sort of last prayer in the garden before he was crucified was for unity. We are not unified. That's just a historical reality, that Christians are not unified fully. We have that shared minimum unity in the sense of our shared baptism. For it is through Christ's Catholic Church alone, which is the universal help towards salvation, that the fullness of the means of salvation can be obtained. It was to the Apostolic College alone, of which Peter is the head, and which we believe our Lord entrusted all the blessings of the new covenant in order to establish on earth the one body of Christ, into which all those should be fully incorporated who belong in any way to the people of God. So that first paragraph we read here is, hey, we've got some unity, we've got a relationship, it's not a total severance between these communities. And, right, it's a both and, there's a community there, and regretfully, it's not a full communion. It's not a fullness of relationship. And a distinction that this paragraph wants to draw out is that the Catholic Church has the fullness, there's that word again, the fullness of the means of salvation. Not the fullness of salvation, the fullness of the means of salvation, right? So what are the means of salvation? It's a very long list, but think of the sacraments. We talked about this in the lecture on the Protestant Reformation, that the Reformers rejected sometimes all of them, rejecting the language of the sacraments. Sometimes they would keep a couple, like the communion and baptism. What this section is saying is, because we have 7 sacraments, that this is, think of it like a toolbox. We have more tools in our toolbox than those other communities. It's not to say those other communities don't have tools and a toolbox. They do. They just don't have a full toolbox. And every time I read this, I always think of my father, who has often said, and maybe your father said this, if you want to do the job right, you got to have the right tools, right? If you don't have the right tools, you can't get the job done, or you can't get the job done right, or you're making it 10 times harder on yourself. So what this is saying is we've got the biggest toolbox. Now, I want to talk about this in our discussion. The Catholic Church here is attempting to walk that tightrope between saying there's a communion there with those other communities, but it's not a fullness. So there's an openness to those other communities, but also at the same time a recognition of the reality of the difference, and claiming to itself, yes, that we have the fullness of the means. We've got a bigger and better toolbox. So how do we think about that? How do we sort of assess that? Do we think that is a beautiful expression of unity, an outreach to our separated brothers, or is this sort of an exclusionary claim of some special privileges at the Catholic Church? How do we think about that tightrope walk that the Catholic Church here is trying to do? Do you think it walked that tightrope well, or did it fall off in one way or another? All right, now what we want to do is move on to a related issue and say not just how does Vatican II think about other Christian groups, but the bigger sphere of all religions, right? That, of course, in the middle of the 20th century with things like trains and planes, etc., the idea of Muslims or Buddhists or Taoists or whatever is no longer really an abstraction in your mind, that you're working with people of other religions and you find out, hey, I like the guy who's working in the cubicle next to me. He's a good guy, and I have a hard time imagining that he's going to be condemned for all of eternity simply because he was born into a religion that he didn't choose to. So there's an added urgency in the mid-20th century, especially coming out of World War II and the Holocaust, to think deeply about this question of how do we think about other religions? So this is the document Nostra Aetate. We're going to read here what the document has to say. This is page 570. This is section 2 in the middle. It's on the bottom of page 570. The Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. We got to stop already and talk about that. Just as I was just saying that we cannot underappreciate the claim that the Catholic Church says our Protestant brothers and sisters and Orthodox brothers and sisters are in a communion with us through the nature of their baptism, that they have some tools in their toolbox, that they're very open, positive language. So too, to say, yeah, in Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., we don't reject anything that's true in those religions and, in fact, holy, right? Things that can lead someone to holiness. Do not underappreciate that. That may, again, sound like something unremarkable, but that just shows how penetrated the Second Vatican Council has gotten into the minds of 21st century Catholics in America. To say that other religions have some truth and holiness to them is no small deal. That's a big, big deal. Let's keep reading. It, the Catholic Church, has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines, which, although differing in many ways from its own teaching, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men and women. Yet it proclaims, and is duly bound to proclaim without fail, Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. In him, in whom God reconciled all things to himself, people find fullness of their religious life. There's that word fullness. That same imagery of the water bottle, that there is some truth and holiness can be found in those other religions. There's some water in that water bottle, although the fullness of the religious life, the full water bottle, is found in the Catholic Church. The Church therefore urges its sons and daughters to enter with prudence and charity into discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians together with their social life and culture. So yes, you can engage with them. Don't stick your head in the sand and hope that they're all going to go away. Engage with them. That's important, and you can and you should do that. With prudence and charity, right? Those virtues that you talk about in your moral theology class. Now, let's go back to that paragraph earlier that I think is key here. That line that says, it has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines which, although differing in many ways from its own teaching, nevertheless, these other religions often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men and women. What's going on there? Well, what do we say in the creed, right? We say, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. What that means, in short, is that all truths, if we talk about truths, mathematical truths, theological truths, poetic truths, whatever truths there are in this world, ultimately come from God, right? So any truths in Catholicism come from God. Any truths in Protestantism come from God. Any truths in Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., come from God. Now, those other religions may not explicitly be talking about Jesus because, well, Hindus and Buddhists don't believe in Jesus. And so that language there of talking about they reflect a ray of truth. Think of it like this. Think of it like at night, once a month, there's a full moon, right? And if you don't know anything about the sun and the moon, when that full moon is shining light down on us, one might be mistaken to think that light is coming from the moon, okay? But you and I know that that's not true, that it's nighttime, so you can't see the sun, but what's happening is the sun is shining light, it's reflecting off of the moon, and then the light comes into our eyes. So the root of the light is the sun, but you can't see the sun because it's nighttime. It's on the other side of the planet. And we can be mistaken for thinking that the light that comes from the moon is coming from the moon. But in fact, it's not. It's reflecting light that comes from the sun. So this is a similar move to what we just saw a minute ago, that the Catholic Church is trying to walk that tightrope and say, yeah, there are truths in these other religions, but that there aren't any special or unique truths to them, because all truths don't come from us, human beings. They ultimately come from God. So we need to understand clearly that any truths that are in these religions don't come from them, any sort of special revelation, that they're ultimately grounded in the truths coming from God. So you see that similar move of trying to be open to those other religions. It's a high wire act, saying there's truth and holiness into them, while at the same time trying to claim that all truths are coming from God, and that Catholicism has fullness of the insight, a fullness of the understanding. But even that understanding, again, cannot be contained in the visible structures of the church. So a similar move from our understanding of Protestants and Eastern Orthodox, and a similar move with our non-Christian brothers and sisters. Walking that tightrope walk, trying to be open to them, while at the same time saying, hey, this is not all religions are equal, right? This is a claim that you hear, not that all religions are equal, but that all religions are the same is what I meant to say. There are people, even today, who often claim all religions are the same, right? That there's no difference between one and the other. The Catholic Church is trying to say, no, we disagree with that not all religions are the same. But there can be some similar ground, a foundation that we can all walk on, we can all stand on, that we can be open to those other religions. So again, in our discussions, let's talk about, what do you think about that high wire act? Is the Catholic Church doing a good job of walking that? Have we become too open to these other religions and Protestants? Are we not open enough? Should we, the Catholic Church, be claiming, as many other people do, hey, all religions ultimately are the same. You want to be, a Taoist? Go ahead and be a Taoist, or a Confucian, whatever. It doesn't matter. Hey, we're all the same, right? Catholic Church isn't making that claim. What do you think? So we'll be talking about that in our discussions. One other point that I want to get to before we move on to Gaudium et Spes, I want to jump back to Lumen Gentium because we're still sticking with this question of other. We started by talking about other Protestants and Eastern Orthodox. Then we talked about other religions. Well, wait a minute. What about people who've never even heard of Christianity? Which may sound like a strange thing to say in the 20th and 21st century. What do you mean? Hasn't everybody at least heard about Jesus? And the answer is, even until today, the answer is no. And I can speak from personal experience. When I was in Peace Corps in Africa, in Mauritania, 20 years ago, I remember once teaching in class, and there was a young woman sitting at the back of the class, and I noticed she was wearing a cross. Not a crucifix, but a cross. And this is, technically the country is called the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. So obviously she was a Muslim. Legally, you have to be a Muslim if you're a citizen of Mauritania. And I was shocked to see this young woman wearing this cross. And none of the students were talking to her or mocking her or harassing her in any way. Later on that afternoon, I actually had a French lesson. Mauritania was a French colony, and so I was trying to learn French. And I was talking to my French tutor, and I told him about this, and he started laughing. And he said nobody was bothering her or harassing her, not because they were sort of being, religiously open. It's because they have no idea what the cross is. To this young woman, this cross is simply a nice piece of jewelry. It's kind of cool. And nobody else in that classroom, these were junior high age students, none of them knew what the cross was. So they had no idea that cross was a profoundly Christian symbol. This was in 2001, 2002. So there are people who've never even heard of Jesus. So that leaves the question, well, what about salvation of those people, right? Are they automatically condemned to hell because they're not Christians? They were never baptized. They never had an opportunity to be baptized because nobody asked them or presented them with an opportunity. To answer that, I want to jump back to Lumen Gentium. This is section 16, and let's see what this has to say here. Section 16 of Lumen Gentium. Finally, those who have not yet accepted the gospel are related to the people of God in various ways. There is, first, that people to whom the covenants and promises were made, Jews, and from whom Christ was born in the flesh, a people in virtue of their election, beloved for the sake of the fathers, and God never regret his gifts or his call, right? Never can forget that Jesus was not Christian. Jesus was a Jew. We often forget that. But the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, first among whom are the Muslims. They profess and hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God who will judge humanity on the last day. So Muslims believe in the same Abrahamic God that we do. They may conceive of him differently. They don't think of God as a trinity, but this is where we get the term Abrahamic religions. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all believe in the God of Abraham. Nor is God remote from those who in shadows and images seek the unknown God, since he gives to everyone life and breath and all things, and since the Savior wills everyone to be saved. Those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek with a sincere heart and moved by grace, try in their actions to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience, these too may attain eternal salvation. Nor will divine providence deny the assistance necessary for salvation to those who, without any fault of theirs, have not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God, and who, not without grace, strive to lead a good life. Whatever of good or truth is found amongst them is considered by the church to be a preparation for the gospel and given by him who enlightens all men and women that they may at length have life. So, they're not automatically condemned to eternal damnation simply because they were born somewhere and didn't know who Jesus was. They couldn't be baptized. It was never offered to them. And at the same time, it's not just, well, they get a get-out-of-jail-free card and can do whatever they want. They have to follow the dictates of their conscience. They have to accept grace, even if they don't know what grace is, accept, let's just call it the movement of God in their hearts, right? So, again, there's that theme of trying to walk that tightrope between, on the one hand, not just saying you're condemned for all of eternity, just because you've never heard of Jesus. But at the same time, you can't just do whatever you want. You can't be a serial axe murderer because your conscience says thou shalt not murder, right? So you can't just do whatever you want. So again, let's talk about this in our discussions. What do you think about this claim here? So this third point, point one was how do we view other Christians? Point two, how do we view other religions? And here the third point now is how do we view people who've never even heard of Jesus? All right, this fourth document we want to talk about now, arguably the most important, Gaudium et Spes, the joy and the hope. This is the dogmatic constitution of the church in the modern world. Can't stick our head in the sands. We got to engage with the world. The longest document of the entire Vatican II documents, and let's just get into a couple of the important sections. We don't have time to go through the whole thing. but just a couple of key points. So this is page 165, section 4. In every age, the church carries the responsibility of reading the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel, if it is to carry out its task. In language intelligible to every generation, it should be able to answer the ever-recurring questions which people ask about the meaning of this present life and of the life to come, and how one is related to the other. We must be aware of and understand the aspirations, the yearnings, and often dramatic features of the world in which we live. An outline of some of the more important features of the modern world forms the subjects of the following paragraphs. All right, so we have to look out at the world, read and this is another phrase that comes out of Vatican II, the signs of the times. How is the current century that we're in different from the 20th, different from the 19th, different from the 18th? What are the philosophical assumptions? How does technology shape our society? We have to read those signs of the times. If your head is stuck in the sand, you can't read anything, right? So you have to pull your head out of the sand, read the signs of the times, and then interpret them in light of the gospel, and then speak the gospel in a language that's intelligible to that world. Not to change the gospel to fit the world, but change the language and the way that the gospel is articulated to make sense to that world that we live in. And then it says, an outline of some of the more important features of the modern world forms the subject of the following paragraphs. So many of the next pages are saying, here is the signs of the times of the mid-1960s, right? Coming out of World War II, for example. The nuclear age, the Cold War, etc. So a lot of what's in this document, like all church documents, is relevant, sort of timeless truths, and other parts are sort of speaking to a historical moment, that mid-20th century moment, which some of that's still relevant today, and some of it is no longer relevant, right? The Cold War is over, for example. Ours is a new age of history with profound and rapid changes spreading gradually to all corners of the earth. They are the products of people's intelligence and creative activity, but they recoil upon them, upon the judgments and desires, both individual and collective, upon their ways of thinking and acting in regard to people and things. We are entitled then to speak of a real social and cultural transformation whose repercussions are felt at the religious level also. A transformation of this kind brings with it the serious problems associated with any crisis of growth. Increase in power is not always accompanied by control of that power for the benefit of humanity. In probing the recesses of their own minds, people often seem more uncertain than ever of themselves. In the gradual and precise unfolding of the laws of social living, they are uncertain about how to plot its course. Let's focus on that last part that I just read there. Think of the technological growths and shifts that have happened in the past 100 years plus, even since this document was written. The technological changes, and yes, there are a lot of goods to that, but it also brings in a shadow side, right? That we cannot have necessarily control of that power for the benefit of humanity, right? As we think about nowadays artificial intelligence, the technology, in a sense, is steps ahead of our understanding of how do we control that for the good of humanity, so it doesn't become a weapon. We want it to be a tool, not a weapon. And we're not always insightful at the same time as technology progresses. And one of the things this leads to is, as it says here, that we are more uncertain than ever of themselves in the gradual, precise unfolding of laws of social living. They are uncertain about how to plot its course. This is hinting at the postmodern situation that we live in, the radical uncertainty, not just uncertainty of simple truths that we talked about in the first video of this series, but just our existential uncertainties, right? We wake up every morning. What are we supposed to do? What are we called to? This is, in my opinion, you're welcome to disagree with this, but in many ways, the root cause of many, though not all, cases of anxiety and depression, right? Think of all the people who are on depression and anxiety medication. Certainly, I acknowledge there are people who have chemical imbalances in the brain, but I think Vatican II is pointing to some wisdom here, that it's not always a chemical issue, that there's a sort of existential issue, an existential dread brought on by the uncertainty of rapid social changes. So what do we need to do? Read those signs of the times, read the reality of those changes, and then be able to update the language of the gospel to be able to speak to it so that we've got something to say, right? We have the deposit of faith. We have the wisdom of the 2,000 years of the Catholic tradition, and we've got a voice to contribute to this public discourse that we have in light of things like anxiety, depression, uncertainty, etc. Just a couple more sections. Now we're on page 167. This is section 6. This is starting to get into what we were just talking about, the changes in the social order, right? As a result, the traditional structure of local communities, family, clan, tribe, village, various groupings and social relationships is subjected to ever more sweeping changes. Industrialization is on the increase and has raised some nations to a position of affluence, while it radically transfigures ideas and social practices hallowed by centuries. Urbanization, too, is on the increase, both on account of the expanding number of city dwellers and the spread of an urban way of life into rural settings. New and more effective mass media are contributing to the spread of knowledge and the speedy diffusion, far and wide, of habits of thought and feeling, setting off chain reactions in their wake. Nor should one underestimate the effect of emigration on those who, for whatever reason, are led to undertake a new way of life. On the whole, the bonds uniting human beings multiply unceasingly, and socialization creates yet other bonds without, however, a corresponding personal development and true personal relationships. Every time I read that, I just think of, Facebook, right? People have thousands of friends on their Facebook page. How many of them are actually true friends? We talk about sort of isolation, loneliness, atomization brought on by this individualism that we have that is stoked by, as this document was just telling us, things like industrialization, urbanization, immigration, etc. So social shifts happening 19th and into the 20th century, and that leads to changes in social relationships, social dynamics. If you live in a big city, you live next to somebody in your apartment block for many years and you don't even know what their name is. I have to plead guilty to that. That's happened to me many times in the past. What does that do to us as a society? What does that do to us as individuals? That's a serious problem. And I think we all know that, and Vatican II here is touching on that. Jumping to page 208, this is section 41, what the church offers to individuals. This is just kind of, we'll end here on this. And it's circling back to a question that we started this semester with. Think back to Augustine's Confessions and that famous phrase at the beginning, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until it rests in you." And we talked extensively about that question of happiness, that Augustine was reaching out in a variety of different ways, trying to find happiness. And he did it through philosophy, he did it through sex, he did it through astrology, he did it through Manichaeanism. He was looking for truth and happiness in all kinds of ways. Similar move here by Vatican II, saying, in this modern world that we live in, we're trying to find happiness in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it's the exact same things that Augustine was trying to do, but there are other things like materialism, right? The sort of material culture, the rise of capitalism, that people trying to find happiness in stuff or fame, right? Nowadays, people want to become YouTube stars. So that same impulse to try to find happiness, though we may try to find it in different ways, now in the 20th and now the 21st centuries. But the impulse is the same. Let's see what Vatican II has to say about that. Contemporary women and men are in process of developing their personality and of increasingly discovering and affirming their rights. The church is entrusted with the task of manifesting to them the mystery of God, who in their final destiny is doing so. It discloses to them the meaning of their own existence, the innermost truth about themselves. The church knows well that God alone, whom it serves, can satisfy the deepest cravings of the human heart, for it can never be fully content with the world and what it has to offer. Right? The stuff that the world has to offer you is not going to bring you ultimately joy and happiness. Right? Only God can do that. The church also realizes that men and women are continually being aroused by the Spirit of God and that they will never be utterly indifferent to religion, a fact confirmed by the experience of past ages and by a variety of evidence today. For people will always be keen to know, if only in a general way, what is the meaning of their life, their activity, their death. The very presence of the church recalls these problems to their minds. The most perfect answer to these questions is to be found in God alone, who created men and women in his own image and redeemed them from sin. And this answer is given in the revelation in Christ, his Son, who became man. To follow Christ, the perfect human, is to become more human oneself. So, not as condensed as Augustine's one sentence, maybe arguably not quite as poetically beautiful, but the same sort of general idea. All right, so let's just summarize what we've done here in these four documents here, right? What they're trying to do is understand who we are and understand the relationship to the world, to other Christians, to other religions, etc., trying to walk that balance between being charitable, being generous, being open, recognizing that there are, in fact, truths and holiness outside of the Catholic Church, while at the same time trying not to say that all religions are exactly the same, that there's something unique or special here. We'll talk about whether or not that balance was achieved or not. And the final comment, I suppose, is to say is that this is, over the past decades, been for many a sigh of relief, and for others, aspects of consternation, right? If, for example, we can say that people who've never even heard of Jesus can be saved if they follow the dictates of their conscience, well, why should I go be a missionary somewhere, right? Why should I go and make a lot of personal sacrifices to go and spread the gospel to other people who haven't heard of Jesus, like in Mauritania, for example? What's the point of that? So there have been negative aspects to that. I would say because of Vatican II, we as Catholics are not as evangelical. Especially if you compare it to our brothers and sisters. Think of the Mormons. They're very evangelical. They give up years of their lives to go and spread the news of Jesus Christ. We Catholics aren't as good as that. We can talk about that sort of from cultural reasons, but I also think the Vatican II has something to do with that. So these documents have been received in a variety of different ways. Some people see them as positive. Some people see them as negative. We can certainly talk about that in our discussion. But what is sort of undeniable is that you, as a pastoral minister, have to deal with these questions in the trenches, in the pastoral life, in your parishes and elsewhere, in your professional lives, as you deal with people who are Protestants or Muslims that you work with. How do you relate with them? How do you speak with them? Do you speak with them about the Catholic Church? Does Vatican II give you the permission just to not even bring that up? I don't think that's what it's doing. There is, in fact, a whole document on missionary activity of the church. We didn't have time to read that, but I would encourage you to do that on your own. So don't need to tell you this, but in the past decades, the sort of implementation of Vatican II, specifically these topics that we've been talking about, has been contested, and that leads to the possible, if you choose it, the paper option in this class, where you think through deeply the questions of implementation. How does the Catholic Church implement these topics in a practical way in the trenches, these topics that we've been talking about in the past few videos?